taking us through our readings. So I will leave this to their Angel and Agnella. You can imagine how the names are.
Praise the Lord. The first reading is taken from 1 Samuel chapter 1, verse 1 to 11. The birth of Samuel. There was a certain man from Ramathaim, a Zophite, from the hill country of Ephraim, whose name was Elkanah, son of Jeroham, the son of Elihu, the son of Tohu, the son of Zuph, an Ephraimite. He had 2 wives. One was called Hannah, and the other Peninnah. Peninnah had children, but Hannah had none. Year after year, this man went up from his town to worship and sacrifice to the Lord Almighty at Shiloh, where Hophni and Phinehas, the 2 sons of Eli, were priests of the Lord. Whenever the day came for Elkanah to sacrifice, he would give portions of the meat to his wife Peninnah and to all her sons and daughters. But to Hannah he gave double portion because he loved her, and the Lord had closed her womb. Because the Lord had closed Hannah's womb, her rival kept provoking her in order to irritate her. This went on year after year. Whenever Hannah went up to the house of the Lord, her rival provoked her till she wept and would not eat. Her husband Elkanah would say to her, Hannah, why are you weeping? Why don't you eat? Why are you downhearted? Don't I mean more to you than 10 sons? Once when they had finished eating and drinking in Shiloh, Hannah stood up. Now Eli the priest was sitting on his chair by the doorpost of the Lord's house. In her deep anguish, Hannah prayed to the Lord, weeping bitterly, and she made a vow saying, Lord Almighty, if you will only look on your servant's misery and remember me, and not forget your servant, but give her a son, then I will give him to the Lord for all the days of his life, and no razor will ever be used on his head. Amen.
I will continue from verse 12. As she kept on praying to the Lord, Eli observed her mouth. Hannah was praying in her heart, and her lips were moving, but her voice was not heard. Eli thought she was drunk and said to her, How long are you going to stay drunk? Put away your wine. Not so, my Lord, Hannah replied. I am a woman who is deeply troubled. I have not been drinking wine or beer. I was pouring out my soul to the Lord. Do not take your servant for a wicked woman. I have been praying here out of my great anguish and grief. Eli answered, Go in peace, and may the God of Israel grant you what you have asked of him. She said, May your servant find favor in your eyes. Then she went her way and ate something, and her face was no longer downcast. Early the next morning, they arose and worshipped before the Lord, and then went back to their home at Ramah. Elkanah made love to his wife Hannah, and the Lord remembered her. This is the word of the Lord. Amen.
Thank you very much, ladies, for taking us through the reading. So if you remember, for those who were here when we started off, I asked you to constantly remember these words from Psalm 10, verse 14. But you, God, see the trouble of the afflicted. You consider their grief and take it in hand. And so this is the story we are going to be reflecting on this morning. Friends, I'm going to be sharing with you. I think we've already gone through the intercessory prayers. We can move on to the sermon. What motivates your prayer life is the title of today's message. And this message, as you can see, or you can imagine, is based on that text we read from 1 Samuel chapter 1, verses 1 to 19. But I just want to share with you, friends, the setting of the story. What was the situation like when the author of this text, sat down to write. This is the opening section of the book of 1 Samuel. And it commences, as we have read, with a description of events that led up to the birth of Samuel. I think many of you have read about this story. So that description of the birth of Samuel is followed by the description of the spiritual growth of Samuel. But as you look at the spiritual growth of Samuel, you would discover that the story is interwoven with a description of the sinfulness of Eli's sons. Eli was the priest at Shiloh during that time. So as Samuel is growing, the story of his life is interwoven with the sinfulness of Eli's sons. And by this time, Eli was advanced in age. And his two sons, Hophni and Phinehas, had taken up the responsibility of being the priest, but they were so wicked before God. So in other words, as Samuel is being born, God had an idea of replacing the wicked sons of Eli with someone who could represent the priestly office well. So you can see the story. Right? Welcome, Joy. Thank you very much. So Samuel is born at a time when the priesthood, the office of the priest, was at a very low ebb. And now that the priestly office had been tainted with sin, what it also meant is that that same situation had a relationship with the whole nation. Think of a nation, think of a people whose leader is not upright. In most cases, the people also follow the pattern, isn't it? In most cases. But of course, there are exceptional cases where certain individuals would still remain faithful. And so, Israel's faith was failing because the priestly office had been tainted with sin. And Israel, as Israel was failing, they were also facing a terrible threat of the Philistines. So you can always see, friends, that each time when people turn their backs on God, there's always disaster that follows. But in that context of an office that had been tainted by sin, of a failing nation as well, one would think that everyone else would just be doing their things. But in such a context, there was a godly man in Israel. Can you imagine? When the sons of the priest were sinning against God, when everyone around was sinning against God, but we have a man who feared God in Israel at that particular time. But this man, though he feared God, he was stuck in a troubled polygamous marriage. So the writer's aim as he writes this story is to tell us that there are worthy, godly people even at a time when such revered religious institutions' image had been tarnished. I don't know if it is resonating with our lives here. That when everyone else is going against God, we see a man and his family who still remained godly. And that can be true to our situation today. God is looking for such. So the message is that when God seeks to do work, he usually looks at sources that he can work with in order to send a message. No matter how dark the situation was, but Eli was one man who feared God. And for us, there is a message that often when it appears, when life appears to be challenging, God can always bring about his purposes in life so that we can confidently look forward and say, all things work together for good to those who love God and to those who are called according to his purpose. And so the setting has this man who had a troubled polygamous marriage. And by the way, polygamy was an acceptable norm during those times. So Elkanah was a polygamist. He had 2 wives, and the first wife was Hannah. The second wife, as we read, was Peninnah. But I want us to look at these 2 women in this story. We have Hannah. We also have Peninnah, or Peninnah, as some may want to call it. Hannah was a very humble and devoted wife. But as I was reading through this story, I was made to look at these 2 individuals who seems to be contrasting members of the same congregation. 2 individuals, but with contrasting characteristics, but being members of the same congregation. So if we look closely at these 2 women, we can realize, brothers and sisters, that just being religious may not help to change the behavior of a person for the good. Just coming to church does not change us to be good people. And this is what we can draw as we look at the character of one of these women. Both these women would accompany their husband Elkanah to Shiloh on a regular basis for the grace feasts. And by the way, Shiloh was the central sanctuary of Israel, where the tabernacle had been built and erected. So the purpose of their pilgrimage to Shiloh was to worship God, and a part of their worship involved sacrificing to God, which Elkanah wholeheartedly did and fulfilled each time. So I want you to have a picture of a family that constantly would come to church, that constantly would sacrifice together. And one would think their frequency and participation at the place of worship would yield some form of deepened spirituality. But details of the narrative points quite to the opposite, particularly if you look at the character Peninnah. Verse 6 and 7 of our text gives details of Peninnah's behavior. And this is what the Bible says. Because the Lord had closed Hannah's womb, her rival kept provoking her in order to irritate her. This went out year after year. Whenever Hannah went to the house of the Lord, her rival provoked her till she wept and could not eat. So if you look at Peninnah, it's sad. Peninnah did not behave well. She is here a bad example of what it means to be a member of the congregation. Instead of rejoicing in the fact that God had given her children, she gloated over her rivals in misfortune. But they were still members of the same congregation. She behaved towards her with great provocation, so as to intentionally upset her. You know, the whole idea is that she did not do it unintentionally, but she did it intentionally to provoke her. And constantly drawing her attention to her inability to give Elkanah a son. And such a behavior would continue even during times of worship. I don't know what was going in the mind of this woman. When people come here, friends, we come here to worship. When we come here, we come to establish a solid relationship with God, and that is the purpose for which we gather. But if you look at this story, as she walked into the tabernacle, her intention was to provoke someone. Such a behavior was uncalled for and ungodly, especially for one who was a member of the same religious grouping with Hannah. So Peninnah's behavior was a bad example of what would be expected of a person who professed the same faith in God. So the situation went on year in and year out. How sad it is to realize that such joyous occasions as going to the house of Yahweh, the house of God, to celebrate and rejoice was marred by such selfishness. As sad as the picture might sound, but the writer seeks to bring out that life can be like that sometimes, and yet we have a God who is over all and can use such circumstances for his own glory. This is what we can infer again from the same story. And so, what can we learn from the story so far? Yes, we have learned of Peninnah's behavior, that it is never enough just to be religious. We need to develop a deeper and intimate relationship with God, and that relationship will help us to realize our mistakes and our spiritual deficiencies. But at the same time, there is also a great emphasis on Hannah's predicament which is intended to be in contrast with the great work of God, with the great work that God was doing to her. This story also brings out the fact that through suffering, there is also a blessing. And that is often God's way of doing things. Jesus speaks of a seed that is sown in John chapter 12:24. For the corn of wheat to multiply, it must fall into the ground and die. So sometimes when this corn of wheat is buried in the ground, you may think that that is the end of it, yet it is the beginning of your life. So as we go through challenges in life, that could be a platform for us to spring back to life. So as Peninnah was gloating over Hannah, Hannah did not respond the same way. This is why I'm saying Hannah was a humble and devoted wife. As a rival was gloating over her and was always looking to, frustrate her, she did not respond the same way. Verse 9 and 10, once when they had finished eating and drinking in Shiloh, Hannah stood up. Now Eli the priest was sitting in his chair at the doorstep of the Lord's house. In her deep anguish, Hannah prayed to the Lord, weeping bitterly. So when Hannah could not bear her provocation and the gloating, she rose up and made her way to the door of the sanctuary. Hannah knew where to take her battle. Friends, if you want to win your battles, don't fight the devil in his own territory. The story is told of an eagle that can kill one of the vicious snakes. But what does the eagle do? It does not fight with the snake on the ground, because once you fight your enemy in his territory, you won't win the battle. But what the eagle does, it takes the snake up into the sky. This is the story. Don't fight on the same level with your enemy. Hannah understood this. I will not fight with Peninnah, but I will take the battle to another level. The common mistake that we often make is to fall into the temptation of fighting in the enemy's territory. So Hannah went into the temple and she prayed. But it's quite interesting to know or to read through the request and the vow, an example of a prayerful woman. Hannah's prayer had two elements in it. First, she poured out her soul before God. And there before the priest in the temple, she was praying in great bitterness of soul. Hannah prayed silently to God, only moving her lips without making any noise. And she was weeping deeply inside her. Sometimes, brothers and sisters, moments of deep intimacy with God are personal moments that do not need a third party. Hannah is mature enough, a prayerful woman who is in a deep relationship with a God who rewards in secrecy. She did not pray on top of her voice to attract human attention and sympathy. She practiced the model of prayer that Jesus taught in Matthew chapter 6, verse 6. When you pray to God, do not be like hypocrites, for they love to pray standing in the synagogues and on the street corners to be seen by men. I tell you the truth, they have received their reward in full. But when you pray, go into your room, close the door, and pray to your Father who is unseen. Then your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you. This is what she did. Secondly, Hannah's prayer had a petition. Hannah prayed to God. Besides her petition, Hannah prayed and vowed to God. She prayed and had a vow, a solemn promise. And she made this vow saying, Lord Almighty, if you will look only on your servant's misery and remember me, and do not forget your servant, but give her a son, I will give him to you for all the days of his life. This is a vow informed by Hannah's understanding that when God answers prayer, it is for the common good of those who pray, and also for the glory of his name. Answered prayer, brothers and sisters, should never be a tool to show off. For Hannah, her request would be granted by God, and she would never use that to vindicate herself or to show off against her rival. Her prayer was motivated by a sense of service. She was not as blind as Peninnah, who believed that blessings were tools for show off. And for this reason, Hannah's request was granted. And Hannah's humility is further explained in the conversation that she had with Eli, the priest, who mistakenly took her to be one of the drunk women, particularly those women of those days who were visiting his sons who had profaned the sacrality of the priestly office. And Hannah addressed Eli and said, my Lord, which is a respectful address, my Lord, and pointed out that she was not one of those women. And upon his recognition of her genuineness, Eli blessed her and told her to go in peace and ask that God of Israel would grant her what she had asked him for. And it was fulfilled. So I'm not going to be talking about the story of the fulfillment, but after Samuel is born, this is the last point, fulfilling the vow. After the son had been born, the last part of our text details the aftermath of Samuel's birth, as we have already read, that Hannah was never selfish. When Samuel is born, she did not deviate from her vow. She took her son to the priest with an offering and went before Eli and told Eli that, oh, my Lord, as your soul lives, my Lord, I am the woman who stood here praying to the Lord for this child. I prayed, and the Lord has granted me my petition, which I asked of him. Therefore, also have granted him to Yahweh or to God. So she fulfilled her promise. She fulfilled her vow. And I want us just to pause as we come to a close. Just to pause and think about this kind of sacrifice and faithfulness. Despite Samuel being the only child, someone we may call Mommy's boy, Hannah had the courage and the willingness to let go. She had made a vow and she was ready to fulfill it. How many of us are faithful enough, brothers and sisters, to keep our words? More often than not, we forget about things. Once we get what we have asked from God, we forget about everything else. But think of this mother who prayed for a child, given a child, and then he surrendered that child. What a lesson we can learn from this woman. She understood that Samuel was a blessing from God. And this is a typical example of the love of God to us. A God who gives away Jesus, his only son. So brothers and sisters, let us borrow a page from this great woman of God as we conclude this service. Just like everyone else, she had emotions, but never allowed them to get the better of her. She knew where to take her battles. She knew how to handle a blessing. She glorified God by fulfilling a vow. What a shadow of the love of God. A God who gives away the best he has, his only son, Jesus Christ. May the Lord bless us. Amen.